you've ever read Genesis 6 and wondered who the Nephilim were, well, don't go away because Dr. David K. Bernard is going to tackle that question on this episode of Apostolic Life in the 21st Century. Dr. Bernard, we want to ask you today a question that repeatedly comes up, that you've been asked many times. We'd like your take on it. It's about the first four verses of the book of Genesis. So I'm going to read it from the New International Version to set the stage for the question. So here's how the New International Version translates the opening of Genesis chapter 6. It says, "When human beings began to increase in number on the earth and daughters were born to them, the sons of God saw that the daughters of humans were beautiful, and they married many of them as they chose. Then the Lord said, 'My spirit will not contend with humans forever, for they're mortal. Their days will be 120 years.'" Here's the part that really raises a lot of eyebrows. "The Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and also afterward, when the sons of God went to the daughters of humans and had children by them. They were the heroes of old, men of renown." I think I would speak for many people in our audience when I say that this is a rather bizarre passage. Who are the Nephilim? How do we make sense of this sons of God having children with the daughters of humans? What's going on here in Genesis 6?
Well, first of all, let me address the term Nephilim in Hebrew. Actually, scholars say the meaning is quite uncertain. Nobody really knows for sure. The King James says giants. And so the most common understanding is these are, if not physical giants, some, as you read, heroes or mighty people or exceptional people. So a common thought, there are basically two explanations. The first one is, well, these are angelic beings who came down and procreated with human women. And that might be at first glance what you would think. And to support that, the people would say, well, the term sons of God is used in the book of Job for angels. 2 Peter and Jude also talk about angels who fell and who sinned. Of course, that itself is not determinative because we all agree that originally, the demons or fallen angels were created by God as good beings, and they fell. So that's not dependent on this passage of Scripture, and it wouldn't imply that they fell in a particular way. In fact, the idea is probably the devil and his angels became evil before the creation of humans, because you see Satan in the Garden of Eden. So 2 Peter and Jude could be referring to nothing more than what we know already happened before Adam and Eve. But here's the problem I have with that whole idea. First of all, it's not explicitly stated in Scripture. Then exegetically, it talks about, yes, these giants were born, but it also says after that. So if you're really talking about this happening in a supernatural way, it would not be just one occurrence, but two, before the flood and presumably after the flood. But the more you think about it, angelic beings, according to Hebrews chapter 1, they are spirits. They're spirit beings. They're not flesh and blood. So they do in the Old Testament, you find, and even in the New Testament, angels appearing in the form of humans. But a human form is different from having a physical human body that would actually be capable of this kind of relationship. And you see this even in Luke 24 when the resurrected Christ appeared to the disciples, and at first they thought he was a ghost or spirit. And he says, no, I'm not a ghost. I'm not a spirit. I've got flesh and bones. You can see me and touch me. A spirit doesn't have flesh like me. Well, is Jesus right? Well, if those angelic beings are spirits, as Hebrews 1 says, and if they don't have flesh, and a normal human could actually look at them or touch them and know it's not flesh, well, then how could this story mean they could actually have physical relationships? And not only that, but let's think through this logically. If they're spirit beings, it would be one thing to say they have the appearance of a human. I grant you that. It would be another thing to say they could actually be tangible and have a body and body parts like humans. I think that's problematic, but let's say that. But that still doesn't mean they could procreate. Procreation, we know, would involve DNA. So do spirit beings have DNA that's compatible with humans? That really seems very bizarre to think that not only reproductive organs, but reproductive capacity reproductive cells that could join with human cells to create a human being or a human hybrid, that goes far beyond anything that the Bible speaks of angels. And in fact, Jesus' words go against that in Matthew 22 when he was addressing something about marriage and the resurrection. He says, don't you even know there is no marriage in the resurrection, but the people in the resurrection are like the angels of heaven. And so you could interpret it very narrowly, well, there's no marriage in heaven, but I think the implication is angelic beings do not procreate. There's no need for them to do so. Just as when we are in eternity, we won't need to procreate. And so whether you think of the sexual relationship, number one, it's for procreation. Number two, it's for union of husband and wife in a spiritual way. Well, neither of those purposes would apply at all to angels. And notice, they would have had to have the capacity before they're fallen. So it doesn't make any logical sense to me that spirit beings created by God would have the ability to physically procreate with human beings. And if they could, is that still happening today? If not, why not? And could it happen with men? You just open the door to a lot of bizarre questions. And I think the scriptures I've given you where Jesus himself said angels do not marry, there's no procreation, angels are spirits, a spirit doesn't have flesh like you see me have. I think that's pretty strongly against it. So then what's the second alternative? Well, if you read Genesis to this point, it's Adam and Eve start off in innocence. They fell into sin. Their son Cain became the first murderer, and then another son, Seth, was born. And Genesis actually traces the two lines and shows that Cain's descendants increased in ungodliness. And you find Lamech, for example. You find polygamy introduced through that line. You find vengeful murder multiplied in that line. Whereas in Seth's line, you see where they begin to call on the name of the Lord, Yahweh. They worship God. So before Genesis 6, there's a very clear attempt to show there was a godly line that worshiped God, served God, and resulted in Noah, who was walking with God even when the whole world started going into sin. But then you had an evil line that was continually separated from God. So the most natural thing would be the sons of God would be these godly humans. Now, some will say, well, that's not used in Scripture. Actually, it is. Hosea 1:10 talks about godly people being the sons of God. Of course, the New Testament does that as well. So if you're going to go to Job to say, well, sons of God could be angels, you can go to Hosea and the whole New Testament to say sons of God could be godly humans. And I really think that's the more logical explanation, that these godly men, instead of seeking God's will, they were tempted by the sinful, and I'm not, all have sinned, but basically there were a group of people trying to serve God, and there were a group of people that had no intention of living for God, and their culture was worldly and secular and evil, just as we have today. And this would fit the rest of the Old Testament, where God wanted Israel to be separate from the other nations, not based on ethnicity, but really based on serving the true God. Because Rahab was not of the ethnicity, but she was brought in. Ruth was not of the ethnicity, but she was brought in. So it's not based on ethnicity, but are you serving the one true God? And if you're not, we can't marry. If you are, then we can. And so I think this is the first example of that, is that godly people, instead of continuing to preserve godly heritage and godly culture and God's will, they were tempted through lust, and they went after women who were ungodly. Now, why would it be the Nephilim? It's a little strange, but maybe it's saying they did excel in the natural, but not in the spiritual. And you do see an example later in Genesis 10 of Nimrod, who was a mighty hunter before the Lord, but yet he was evil, and he established the city of Babylon. So maybe that fits in where the Bible is saying these godly men were tempted and went after daughters of evil men, when they should have kept a separation. And the result was, in a physical sense, maybe great success. Mighty men, renowned men, but evil men, not force for good, but a force of evil. And you see the contrast. Noah was a mighty man in the spirit. Well, these were mighty men, but only in the flesh. And then that would also make sense of the statement after that. It happened again in the sense of after the flood, not a second fall of some angelic being and second procreation of some mythical beings who theoretically could exist today if it was after the flood. Who among us is really not a human, but, a son of an evil spirit? But if you look at it as this is a recurrence of mighty men like Nimrod, who were sinful men. So they were mighty in the flesh, but they were flawed in not serving God. So even though that passage may sound a little strange, I think the idea that spirit beings could procreate and have DNA and have reproductive cells is so beyond what anything we see in Scripture. And actually, as I've already pointed out, I think contrary to the clear statements of Jesus, I think we're left with the more logical alternative. Here's an early example of God wanting His people to be separated from the world around them.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Apostolic Life in the 21st Century. If you enjoy this podcast, please take a moment to give us a review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or your favorite podcast app. If you're watching on YouTube, make sure you subscribe to Dr. Bernard's channel, like this video, and leave a comment. We also encourage you to check out Dr. Bernard's books. Visit pentecostalpublishing.com and search for David Bernard to access a full list of titles. Don't forget to enter DKB10 at checkout to save 10% on your order. We look forward to seeing you again next week as we explore how modern-day believers can live out the teachings of the first century church.